Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 235. Today's topic, the effects of an Orcus.
No.
You're right. I should have said Orcish.
No. We're done with orcs. We have done 2 episodes. It was supposed to be 1 episode. We've been talking about doing the primitive death rite deep dive for like ever now. We're doing it.
But
death
orcs,
rites.
They all cause more
death rites. Start again.
Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 235. Deep dive into death rites of primitive religions.
That's right.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world?
Do you need more? Does it make sense?
Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination.
This is the place where we will prime your mind.
Now, it's time to heat up the forge,
break out the mithril ingots and hammer.
Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
Let's sup from the muck of Java and build. Welcome back, as always.
Welcome back. I'm Michael Miller.
And we are doing death rites.
Sorry we took so long to get this to you guys. And I had to laugh because I was sharing it with my wife yesterday. I was on like the 4th episode of us trolling you guys with this title. And I just laughed and laughed. And she's like, it's not that funny. And I'm like, I know. It's just that we've been teasing this episode for like 4 episodes. So.
You know, if you're following them in sequence right now, it's very amusing. Other people might be a little confused why we're arguing over orcs. But essentially we talked about doing this episode a while ago, the last time we did a religions episode. Michael and I have behind the scenes been talking about this. And then we just thought that would be a funny way to hop in. And then we've just kind of carried it out. And here we are, episode 235. I think it was 230 or 231 was the first time we joked about actually on the air doing this episode.
So here we are. The deep dive of death rites of primitive cultures.
Yes. And once again, getting to this, I'm a huge fan of diving into looking at how things actually happen, because one of the neatest ways to derive, if you need a death rite, is to sort of look at the different variations, because the problem is a lot of times, especially in religion, we get Western ideas mixed in, sort of modern Abrahamic religions ideas of religion mixed in whenever we develop religions. So they have a tendency to always kind of come out as some kind of variation of that. Even if it's ancient polytheistic religion, it still has a church structure, and people go to church on Saturday or Sunday or Friday, and it's this very, very much akin to sort of modern Western religions.
I mean, would you call the Abrahamic religions primitive, though?
I mean, they were. Religions, like all things, evolve. A lot of times it's more slowly than other things. But if you were to go look at the way a Christian service is done today, and you could go back to even like the 5th century AD, it's completely different. Or even before that, when they were still persecuted, obviously it would be even more different at that point. So any religion that still exists today, as it's done today, is not the way it was done. Some religions are a little bit closer at holding on to rituals from a long time ago, but there are even some where it's like they think, like in Hinduism, some of the religions go back to the Bronze Age, and they still do them, but the people who speak the words don't even know what they mean anymore. But they still use the same exact tones, and they do the exact same things that were done a long time ago. And I'm not, a religious expert, so I could be off a little bit, but that's my understanding from watching way too much stuff on this. The way I always like to look at anything where I'm looking at actual Earth for inspiration is I always look more at patterns, not specifics. Even though sometimes you have to you kind of run into some specifics that become really interesting. So I don't think actually in the show notes for this episode have any actual cultures listed here. There are some that will probably be talked about as we go along, but The bigger thing is to understand the patterns. And in my research, there are essentially 6 things that reoccur a lot. And some are odd and some are not so odd. So people burn them, bury them, preserve them, reincarnate them, dump them, and eat them. Those are kind of the things that sort of reoccur across different cultures. Some of which are, most of these to some degree are still done today, but like eating is probably much
less
rare
common, probably
today, because there are probably some cultural ickiness with that. Usually most cultures view dead bodies as a little gross, which is probably kind of good because you can get sick if you hang out with dead bodies too much.
Certainly, you can get sick from eating them. But
I would think so. You probably have to cook them, so there's probably a bit of burning in there. But yeah, I apologize to the audience for that. I can't help myself. I was thinking very much of, there's a classic Monty Python.
I was just going to say that because it just all of that reminded me of Crackle, Crackle, Crackle.
Crackle, Crackle, Crackle. I'll try and put a link to the show notes if I can remember. But yeah, there is a wonderful, but that's the thing, right? It's like people will burn the bodies to dispose of them. And a lot of times it's driven by like local needs. Like in a lot of places, like Christianity, like most places, we bury the dead 6 feet underground, and that's the way you do it. But in certain places, that's not true, and it's from either earlier cultural influence or it's because of geography necessities. Like and I've talked a little bit before about the cities of the dead near Barcelona. There's like carved out mountains with like people get married into the side of the mountain. It's a very cool thing to look at. If you're in Barcelona and you're driving out of the city, you can't miss it. You just can't miss it. Like you go from the airport down to the shore, you're going to drive right through them. It is a gorgeous thing to see. The tomb of King Herman that Michael invaded in one of the episodes about Marcus and Div Devar. That was very much inspired by Barcelona's burial hills. And like in New Orleans, they can't bury the dead because it's a high water table. So especially like if it floods, it would push the bodies up above ground and they would float. And that would probably not be culturally appropriate for them. So they actually bury them above ground. I would assume burning's probably a little bit more common in that kind of environment when you have less ground to do it. The less ground you have, the less burying you're going to do. So burning becomes a good option to that. Whether you go like Viking style and burn them out at sea, or however you want to deal with burning them, sometimes it just becomes a necessity because you don't have the location to store them. Preserving is an interesting one. People typically think of Egypt with this, and creating mummies. There were obviously mummies in the Andes Mountains as well too. And I think there's even some kind of argument where they would take the bodies out to caves, and the arid weather in the Andes could turn them into mummies.
Mm-hmm.
And then they could
jerky
bring them back sometimes. And I don't know if all the time, but at least sometimes there was some evidence that like the mummification would actually be brought into the house and left in the house itself. Literally living with the family. You would continue to live with the family. And I believe that sometimes like they would bury parts of the house. And I don't know, with the lack of the writing that has survived, we don't know the specifics, but your brain can go a lot of different ways where maybe you would bury part of the house and you would build on top of it. Maybe it would be every generation or two that would happen. And that's also kind of the reason why you get these kind of mezzanine style structures that people live in. And I think it would depend a lot too on how wealthy the families were. Poor families probably aren't going to have the same option to store the dead in the house that the richer families are. So it could be a status thing as well too, to have like your great Uncle Fred sitting literally mummified on your mantle.
I feel like in the Western world, we kind of have this bit about preservation. We get these expensive coffins. They talk about how well sealed they are, and then you formaldehyde the body, and it's all in, that's all preservation.
I think it's the West trying to adopt some of those things.
Yeah, I think it's wasteful. Yeah. I think it's all a terrible idea, personally.
Yeah, no, I say burn me or eat me, whatever. It won't bother me, or my body at least. No matter what happens to me afterwards, the body is kind of disconnected at that point.
Right.
So I doubt most people would go for eating, but I think I would be delicious.
I'm not going to speculate on that.
I'm going to speculate on that.
Barbecue sauce, I'm sorry. Go on.
Nice dry rub. That's right. You definitely would want to barbecue me. So preserving could happen in non-dry areas. They typically are very common early on in dry areas because it's a lot easier to preserve a body if you have a very dry climate. If you have a wet climate, especially if it's wet and hot, it's very, very hard to preserve bodies. Except they found one thing, and I don't know if any religions have ever utilized it, but it's kind of caught my brain as a possible way to deviate this into different cultures, or peat bogs. Peat bogs will preserve bodies. So you could actually, if you had a large peat bog near a village, they might have a tradition of burying their dead in the peat bog, which would then preserve the bodies.
How does it preserve them?
I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I just know that they found the best preserved body in Europe ever in a peat bog, and it literally still had the skin on it. And it was 3,000 years old with skin, which is pretty impressive. So
wow.
So it definitely works. So you might have something else in your world that sort of comes up to that, to where a body can be preserved. Ice, obviously, typically where there's a lot of ice all of year round. Once, especially it's in the ice, it's going to be dry. So there are a couple different ways you can get to it, even though on Earth, it's definitely most common in dry cultures, especially early on. And the other interesting thing too is a lot of times when you have preservations, a lot of times, even if you don't keep the dead buried in your house, there are some places, and I think this happens, in parts of India up in the mountains, where I believe what they do is on the anniversary of the death, they will go into the tomb and they will bring the person back out, and they will take them on a procession through the town, much in the same way that most primitive polytheistic cultures would go into the temple to grab the bust of the god or the statue of the god and do a procession through town, do a festival. Especially if your culture worships their ancestors, this could very definitely be a thing that happens, where it's either on a community scale for a more important figure, or maybe it's just a family doing it, bringing it back to the house for a party to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the death of the patriarch or the matriarch of the family.
You definitely see with festivals, you'll see that, them walking around with a statue of Mary or a statue of Jesus or what have you. Do you know how far back they would go? So if somebody in the family died, would they do it every single year? Because at that point, once a bunch of generations have died, then you're carrying a lot of bodies.
What happen is, once you get past the point where maybe their kids are no longer able to do it, that generation would probably stop being celebrated in that way. There might be a thing depending on the climate too, where maybe it's depending on how well preserved you are too. I think that's very, very much radical, or they might have to wait a certain period of time before they even start to make sure your body is properly preserved before they can start doing it. Because most, even very primitive cultures, understand that around dead bodies, diseases can spring up, especially when you eat them, except for the ones that do that. Dumping is actually a relatively common thing if the body is not important to a religion, if it's just a
vessel, a
vessel that's carrying the soul, which is the important part. Once the soul's left the body is not important. You dump it, and maybe it's part of it being renewed into the actual ecosystem. Maybe it's to encourage reincarnation, to where, I know in Tibet, they will actually dump the bodies up on the plateau, which is where they live, obviously, but out away from their village. And the vultures are meant to eat them. There are other places in the world that do that too, where they leave the bodies for vultures to eat, which I don't know this specifically, but I think it probably has some more to do with local beliefs in reincarnation to help ensure that the parts of you very quickly start spreading through and maybe giving you a few bonus points towards coming back as something a little bit better than what you were. Mm-hmm. Even though I'm not a religious expert on all religions. I just look and I make up stuff based off of what I see. So yeah, don't try and use any of my discourse to convince a college professor without actually finding stuff to back it up, because I find little things and I let my imagination play. That's the way you world it. But dumping is actually big. And obviously I don't just mean in like naughty ways, like we're getting rid of bodies, but like as actual part of the ritual is you would carry the body out one last time and you would dump it in the jungle. I would find this to probably be more likely in places where there are either creatures that are carrion, or maybe it's even at a cave. You go back to the same cave and just dump the body down a big pit in the cave. I know there have been lots of caves they found where there are tons of bones from animals and from humans all in one pit, because for generations, they would just probably dump sacrifices down into the pit. And sometimes I'm sure things would accidentally fall down there too. But it was just like really deep pits within caves, which sometimes when you see like modern archaeologists getting to them, just getting to the point to drop the body off is really impressive in the Stone Age, where, it doesn't take very far underground to get pitch black. And somehow they would find these really deep pits in areas that are pitch black for hundreds of feet. Sometimes there are multiple levels you're moving through to get to the right pit to drop it in. But especially if your culture feels like there's an underworld, which is part of like really underneath the world, it's very common to have these kinds of practices. And now eating. This one is not done too much anymore and has been done in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's eating the family.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre style?
No, religiously. Like you would just at least nibble a bit, but I think you would die upon the lost, and it would probably be in a cultural group that is food is very restrictive, probably, and it would probably be done relatively quickly. Some cultures you would eat part of people, like their heart, for instance. To gather the strength of the fallen person. So if they were a great warrior and you wanted to be a better warrior, you would eat maybe their heart or some part of them that was commensurate to that, as, literally a magical spell to gain more power. That's probably the more common way to do it. And it could also be done as a religious thing on the battlefield. Like there's some argument that the Norse would eat people after battles. And I don't know how true it is because it was written by the English who was getting their butts kicked by them.
So it might have been bad propaganda.
It might have been either a sacrifice to sort of like help instill terror in the local population. So, that could be done too as well. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination, most cultures that even performed a lot of human sacrifice would. I don't think there's any evidence to show that just because a culture would perform human sacrifice means that they would necessarily eat anything. I think it would be more likely they would burn the bodies to let the smoke rise up to heaven. But that's something you can play with as well, too, as you're building out religions. Just realize that some people would probably be a bit disturbed by that in any works that they would partake in, even in a game. Sometimes people can get upset over stuff like cannibalizing, which is kind of why I make fun of it, because it helps take the edge off for me personally. Now,
so you haven't eaten your ancestors?
I've not eaten my ancestors. I it's one of the few things I actually would find disgusting. But I don't judge others. Okay. Now, on top of the way you dispose of them, the most common thing is for it to become a religious ceremony is how it's done. And typically, In the West, we have sort of a public thing that we do where it's like you have a viewing or a ceremony where you just kind of put out in the newspaper and people will show up to wish the family is sometimes to wish for the family the best. But, the religious ceremony itself is actually typically public or semi-public, not always. It tends to lean that way, especially religiously. So that's one of the things you think about is in a culture, how do you do it? Think of like an old culture like Rome, which was very public facing. There was always a public side to especially your big houses. You would have a public ceremony to deal with the death of people in the family. Other cultures where it's more private are going to go in and lock themselves away to perform it because, it's what is culturally appropriate for your culture. And the other thing is how obvious or big are your displays of grief. Some cultures, you're ripping clothes. Some cultures will literally amputate parts of their body if their children die. Yes, there's one. I always shoot for Papua New Guinea area because that's where a lot of these types of things happen.
Really?
There's a tribe out there that, I think it's only if their kids die, will amputate a finger. That is rough. Yes, and I think, but it's just a way for them to, and it's because of their religious beliefs.
It's bad enough to
let the grief out. Some cultures are going to be typically more stoic, where maybe they're not allowed any display of grief publicly. And with their go probably show less grief even privately. Where other cultures are going to go the other way, where they would be required to make some public show of grief. Maybe it's just, think wearing black, you're supposed to wear black when a family member dies. And some, I think it's more ethnically based Christians do that. And I think it probably goes back to earlier ways that death was celebrated from the cultures that the people belong to. I don't think that's a all-around Christian thing. I just don't see it enough, to create a pattern there. But definitely in some cultures in Christianity, it's like this idea of wearing black. And I think it's a public grief display that you are grieving, and this is the way that you grieve from where those people are from.
So in all this, and I know you still got a few more here, but in all these things that you have looked at and discovered, is there any kind of, I don't know if I want to use the word pattern or just something weird that you notice about all these, comparing them?
Well, I'm going over, so far it's the common patterns I'm going over, which eating's one of them. And I find that to be a weird one too. But we'll get into the weird ones here in a second. And I've kind of hit a few of them already, so I'll just kind of probably quickly go over those. But the thing is, a lot of times it's not necessarily to the survive. Sometimes it's the survivors that the patterns happen to, and sometimes it's to the bodies themselves. Mm-hmm. So, and that's kind of why I'm just trying to get to the patterns of, the types of way people do it. And then typically the religious ceremonies themselves usually have more to do with preparing the body and the actual act of disposing of it. And over time, ceremony can build up around that as well too. But if it's your culture that burns, the religious ceremony will be to prepare the body to be burned and then to burn the body, which is usually an act of purification. Maybe you're not naturally clean enough to pass along and start your journey. Or maybe there's a chance you're tethered back to this planet because of the old body. So you have a ceremony to help prepare the body and then dispose of it via fire or burying, preserving it correctly, reincarnating, which typically leads to dumping and then eating, of course. And I've not seen any cases of families actually eating themselves. It's usually only the dead thing that they're going to eat. But there are some weird ones, and this, I don't know if it still happens, but in some older, larger cultures, I know China did this. I think there's been some places in Mesoamerica as well that they found, and kind of spattered throughout is this idea, and the Vikings too were known for this, is having other people join them on the journey. So, I think it was if you were a Viking consort, a lot of times you would in grief throw yourself on the funeral pyre of the fallen warrior, and die and join them in the afterlife. There were evidence in China where they would actually very early, this is very early pre-modern dynasties, they would actually take the wives and sometimes like the servants and stuff, shove them underneath because the guy would need them in his afterlife and just bury them alive with the body.
Oh, that's awful.
That is awful, yes. And that might have happened in Egypt at one point, but Egypt had like totem magic, so like you'd build little totems of everything to go along, and then you put jars and stuff in of food as well too. Because typically, if there's some type of reincarnation, especially if your body was important, where they would preserve it as part of the reincarnation, a lot of times there's going to be burial goods of things that you're going to need to either complete your journey to get to the afterlife, or to help give you a head start when you're reborn finally again. Or maybe even as bribes along the way. Think of like the coin, very popular in the Hellenistic Mediterranean, where you'd put a coin because the coin would be needed to bribe the ferrymen to get them across the river so that they could finish their journey and hopefully get to Elysium, but probably not. And talk a little bit too, amputations of survivors. Maybe it's like your child dies or something like that. Some form of amputation, usually digit-based, finger or toe, think of that kind of thing. I've only heard of fingers, but once again, when you're developing it, go with something that makes sense. If you chop off entire arms, especially in a primitive agrarian or nomadic culture, the likelihood they're going to lose children is high. They're probably going to lose more than one. Within the first 5 years, which is going to cause a lot of limbs to be lost, which also leads to sort of different ways of birth rites, but that's a different episode. Amputation of the dead person as well. So maybe you're taking a locket of their hair. Maybe you're cutting off their finger to hang it as an amulet so you can keep their power close to you. But there could also be some form of that where there's a part of that person taken and passed along. And, and this even like in some traditions of Christianity and Catholicism kind of passed along with, I have the elbow of Saint John. So I'm going to put that in my church. People will come to the church to be surrounded by the holiness of the elbow of John or the finger of Peter or whatever. So even if you think that a lot of times, these can pervade up into very modern religions, where I do think even in many Christian churches today, there are relics. Sometimes the relics are an entire dead person or parts of an entire dead person buried or preserved in the church as a shrine for people to come to visit. So I don't know if too many American churches have stuff like that, but I definitely know a lot of the European churches, and I would assume a lot of the churches in other parts of the world do as well too. And maybe here, but I'm not Catholic, so I can't speak to that, but maybe the bigger cathedrals in the U.S. do. I'm not sure.
We saw a bit of that when we were in Germany.
But no, one of the big parts of Christianity medieval pilgrimage, you couldn't go to Jerusalem, so you would go to a temple in France to, see it, either remains or a finger, or sometimes it's not always necessarily going to be that, but it could be like a splinter of the cross or something like that too, in Catholicism, but oftentimes it's part of the dead people. We are talking about the anniversary of the dead, and one of the weird ones I found was the bodies moving back into the house, and not buried. Which I've only heard of this in the Andes Mountains, if I remember correctly, in the southern part where it's very, very arid, and I think it wouldn't work well in most places. Even just a little bit of humidity would turn that really bad until the body's, even if the body's completely mummified. And the skin's all leathery at that point, it'll help protect it. But, you definitely couldn't pull this off in humid conditions. But if it's either like somewhere, near glaciers where there's a cold sea current and it's very arid, they would be required to they could maybe pull this off. But it would have to be a very, very dry area, an area with very little precipitation, very little humidity. Now, the thing is, the more important part of this episode, or what are the questions to pull out of this, right? Is, okay, so I think we're just going to call it here. We'll have some questions. That'll be great for you to go over. We'll do that in a later episode because there are quite a few, and we're trying to get the episodes a little bit shorter in time. But
what we could do is maybe pick a culture in your world and create some death rites for a culture that you haven't fleshed out. We can use these.
Well, I don't think I have any death rites for any cultures because I never did it. I don't need them. I don't build stuff until I need it. So I know the rhythms and how it'll probably work, but I've never really planned any of them out because it's never been featured in my storytelling.
I'm just saying, as a building exercise, maybe we do that. We'd go through these questions and actually act upon them.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
But we'll save that for another episode.
Save that for another episode. So the world building task of the day is to create a death rite for your world. Just make one up. Just kind of look at those patterns, those first few things, and start at least a skeletal framework of what a death rite would look like. That would be appropriate to the culture. And the big thing is always just going back and saying, hey, does this make sense for this culture? And that's really the game. And the level of detail is based off of your need.
Now, the real world task is don't eat any dead people. This should not be difficult to achieve.
We expect to give everyone an A for this who listens to this episode at least.
But by all means, come to the Facebook page and tell us how you did.
That's right. So go to facebook.com/Undercroft and tell us if you've not eaten any dead people. Please tell us you've not eaten any dead people.
Yeah. If you have, don't tell us. We don't.
Just lie.
Just don't say, yeah.
And I'm also going to link to a Death Rite episode in the show notes as well, too. So if you go to the show notes for episode 235 on guardduel.com, just go onto the podcast or search 235. The episode will pop up. And there'll be a link to some, of the Death Rite information. Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil.
We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends.
And so would they.
If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting.
Take them to Stitcher or iTunes, or best of all, just send them to our website, www.guardduel.com.
That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.